Hi.
Hi.
I'm aware of the very high rate of marriages of parliamentarians that break up.
Yep.
I'm wondering whether it's something comparable with the press based in, or not.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. You know, it is a very kind of inbred industry. I think it was back in the 1998 election campaign. I remember at the time a statistic that struck me that there were 8 women in the press gallery who were pregnant through the 98 election campaign, and 6 of them had their partners also in the press gallery. I can't tell you the statistic on how many of them are still together. I think most of them are, but I don't think we have a very good. We probably don't have a great success rate because of the nature of the hours worked and some of the stresses and pressures. I think probably that puts pressure on family life and on health. I think people in political journalism are a bit healthier than they used to be. We don't get as much exercise necessarily, some of us, but I don't think there's as much smoking and drinking as there used to be. There's no bar, there's no non-members bar in Parliament House anymore. It's a childcare centre now. Yeah. So there you go. Maybe that gives you a bit of an indication of the change in the demographic, but also the nature, the kinds of things I was describing before about the pace of journalism. There's no time anymore. There's not nearly as much standing around in the hall comparing notes as people think there is, because no one has any time to do that. You always have to do something. If you're a TV or radio journalist, you've got to do some print thing to put up on your website, and if you're a print journalist, you've got to do a video blog thing, and everyone's always got to do something on top of what they used to have to do. So, and that's why you're seeing, I think, journalists getting younger and younger too, because we're going through one of those arcs in journalism where the next generation are technologically savvier than we are, and proprietors are looking and saying, well, they can do everything, we can pay them probably even a bit less, and they can do twice as much, and they won't know that it used to be any different, so we'll hire these people. So I think there's quite a lot of that going on. So you're seeing a changing of the guard and a change in the nature of the work, but hopefully they're a bit smarter about the way they manage their stress than some of us old dinosaurs have been in the past. But so I don't know statistically the answer to your question, but I wouldn't have thought it's got much better rate, and certainly I think it's even harder on politicians because they're away from home so much, and the hours are strange, and they're public people, so they're always having to be working on weekends even when they're at home and that kind of thing, and that's pretty tough on family life, I know.
Thank you.
My Jefferson Lee, organiser of the second centenary of anti-conscription plebiscites and referendums.
Oh, don't say those words, they make me shiver.
Where the no vote, the only legitimate no vote, was victorious in 1917. It'll be December the 3rd at the other venue for politics in the Park Pagoda Club.
Politics in the pub, is that it?
Well, the breakaway one, it'll be Sunday afternoon, 3 to 7, if anyone wants to come along. It's an open blackboard performing menu if anyone wants to get up and read a poem or say something. It's also an Agent Orange Justice benefit concert in commemoration of 12 years on from Dennis Kevin's Australia's Poet Laureate. Now I've got the advertising out of the way.
Everything else is advertising.
Podcast Killed the Radio Star is the lead front page article in this week's City Hub, which has been going 35 years. And just to quote one paragraph, local podcast producer Jono Pesh is a shining example of how simple it can be to gain a following through podcasting. Pesh began his weekly podcast putting in work in February, and though the audience is still small, it's gaining traction. And then it goes on to talk about Jen White, who was recently here talking about her podcast, Making Opera. Now, the article is basically saying that podcasts are killing the radio star, i.e. the ABC and everybody else, because people can go straight to their podcast if they've got the appropriate app and they don't have to listen to radio. And this refers back to some of the technological changes that you were referring to, and this is just another example. But I'd like your reflection on that, but before I do that, I wanted to contradict what you said about the changes only coming in the last 5 or 10 years. To my way of thinking, listening to the ABC and watching SBS News throughout most of the 90s and early 2000s as an avid viewer, it was my opinion that 702 radio changed from the Andrew Ollie Let's Nail 'em in his morning breakfast program to celebrity stars, and we've got to have Jennifer Byrne, or we've got to have James on at 1 o'clock, or we've got to have Richard Glover on at 3 for Drive. And these people, rather than being job snobs, tend to hold down 5 different jobs, whether it's Sydney Morning Herald or whether it's 702 or whether it's whatever. So my question really relates to listening to Richard Glover's Journos Forum every Tuesday. Now, I criticised his treatment of Greg Sheridan, the foreign editor of The Australian, over his book When We Were Young and Stupid, but he called it When We Were Young and Foolish.
I need the question.
Well, the question is, have the journalists really gotten to bed too closely with each other, whether they be radio or print, over the last 20 or 30 years, to the point that they're all celebrities and they all drift away from the truth as a result of it, because they'll pat each other on the back rather than examine the real issues like Andrew Ollie used to.
I think the nature of that's a good point, and they've raised a couple of things that I should have touched on before, but I think that the nature of journalism has also changed, and technology's done this a bit too, in that yes, there is much more of that celebrity thing now, and you are much more encouraged to be a brand, and employers care about your engagement on social media, not only to make sure that you're not doing anything that damages their brand, but also preferably that you're someone who's popular and attracts an audience in your own right. So it used to be that only the masthead in a newspaper's case, or the TV brand or the radio brand, was the brand, and you were kind of anonymous underneath it. In fact, I remember the days when I was a cadet at the Canberra Times when we used to report on court proceedings, and the rule there was you didn't ever get a byline, because you were deemed to not be injecting your personality if your name was on the top of it, which meant that if you were the court reporter, you went for years and years and years without ever having any evidence of what you'd written, because nothing had your name on it. These days, yes, it has gone to an extreme. There are journalists interviewing journalists, and that's partly a result of that kind of 24-hour news thing I was talking about before. When they run out of politicians to talk to, they talk to each other. We talk to each other. We do that. In fact, I've got another call coming up, driving up the highway this afternoon from a radio station in Perth. Could I talk to them tomorrow afternoon about what's happening in politics? So they do get journalists to do reports on politics. I would like to think that it's not all about look at me, that it still is about here's what's actually going on. But it does depend on the personalities of the people involved, and sometimes there are just people that you as a listener, as a radio listener, connect better with than other people. So maybe you connected better with the way Andrew Ollie conducted himself on air, and I'm sure there was less commercial tone to it probably back then than there is these days.
They were more prepared to ask the hard
Hang on, Jeff.
Maybe that's the case. Maybe that's your perception. I would say I know plenty of people who still ask the hard questions, but I'm also familiar with the perception of the hard question being in the eye and ear of the beholder sometimes. So I think sometimes different people can see that differently, but I take your point. That's fair enough. But I do think there has been a change in that commercialisation thing. And one of the other elements of what you mentioned that I pick up on is the shift to online journalism has also changed the nature of the content. I sort of touched on this before, but because they lost all that advertising revenue, now the pathway to advertising revenue is clicks. And that has naturally, for some publications anyway, changed the nature of the mix of news that you're seeing when you click on you open up a website for a media organisation, because it's naturally designed to make you go, oh, I want to know about that. And we can't help ourselves, we're prurient, we like to think we're not interested in the gossip, but the fact that we click on it so much indicates that we are, and that's how they make their advertising revenue. So I think you've seen I didn't hear that. I think you've seen a change in the quality of the content and the nature of the content, and that probably goes to some of the things you're talking about. It's dumbed down a bit, and it's bottom, sort of baseline, designed to attract your attention and be a bit salacious sometimes, because that's how they're getting their advertising revenue. They can say to the advertisers, look, we got X number of clicks. Where that starts to get complicated is if they feed that back to their staff and say, oh, did you know that story about climate change, nobody was interested in it, but that story about, someone having an affair with someone, oh, they were very interested in that, and the subtext is like more of that and less of that. And that's where it starts to get difficult for employees. But you make some interesting points, yeah.
Thanks, Karen. I'm Karen. I was hoping you could comment on the proposed changes to the media laws, because that sounds like it's a good
Speak into the
goal.
microphone, please.
Yeah, the proposed changes. Yes, and in fact I had that on the bottom of my notes and I cut myself off. And that's a bit related to that thing I said about the bureaus all closing down, and we used to go to the barricades for diversity, and for decades there was a pushback by both some proprietors but a lot of journalists, sort of working journalists, against some of the changes that have just been made. But I think there's so much of a feeling now, well, for a start, there are so many fewer of us. We don't have the numbers anymore to do that, and I think the landscape has changed along the lines that we've just been talking about. So there's a view that those media laws are perhaps now a little outdated, because you're seeing the podcast universe and the online universe, and that talking about a major television network and how much reach it has to a population is a bit outdated, when people can go online and see, you can be anywhere in the world and see a news story. No longer do you have to be, under the satellite in a particular place. So it's interesting to me that after all those years of fighting and different people pushing back against those media changes, they've just, there was some negotiating and horse trading in the Senate, but they've just sort of sailed through. So the reach rule, the 2 out of 3 rule, where you couldn't own more than 2 out of the 3 major print, radio or television outlets in one market, and you couldn't reach more than 75% of the population. Those laws have now gone, and what they got in return, I think Nick Xenophon got a $60 million fund to encourage journalism, particularly in rural and regional areas, for cadets and training and that kind of thing. But One Nation got an investigation into the ABC and the idea of fair and balanced coverage, which again is, in my view, in the eye of the beholder. And I remember Paul Keating using that kind of phrase as well, about balanced coverage. I was at the Placido Domingo speech a really long time ago, 1990 I think it was, when he spoke to the Press Gallery's annual dinner, and he talked about, you're either with me or you're against me, and there was a very interesting reaction to that kind of sentiment, because we were all kind of a bit shocked that he would be so blunt about how he saw the media and the role of media in reporting politics, because we all, idealistically fancied ourselves as being fair and balanced. But he had a different idea of what being fair and balanced was, and in his view that meant being in favour of him. And I think that's what we see One Nation, that's what they think. They think more of this, less of this. And we're seeing the same thing playing out in a whole lot of public debate in the debate about free speech. It amuses me that the people who are most vociferously in favour of free speech are the first ones to say that someone should stop talking, like we've seen the NRL Grand Final. the international singer they've got booked, who happens to have a song that's against homophobia, that was hit last year or early this year, and is one of his songs, and the NRL fans were asked who they wanted to play, and that was who they picked. And now all the free speech advocates are saying it's an outrage and he shouldn't be allowed to sing. So it always puzzles me that we get this idea of what's appropriate and what's inappropriate, and I think that's played out that has played out as part of the negotiation in these media laws, and it'll be interesting to see how that is handled, that inquiry into the public broadcasters in particular, and whether there is much pressure applied for change, or more pressure applied for change to the way that they operate. They've been under pressure under this current government, or the incarnations of this government, and they tend to be under more pressure from the conservative side of politics than the left, but they still are occasionally under pressure from the Labor side of politics too, if they start to run stories that make people uncomfortable. So it is interesting, just that these media laws, which have been so controversial for so long, have now just kind of gone through. And part of that is also there aren't the people with the deep pockets in this country to maintain the diversity of ownership that we would love to have had. In the past we have had, but there are fewer and fewer. And the reality is that there aren't that many people willing to invest in media, in old media companies anymore. And so I think you are going to see an increasing shrinkage of ownership. It'll be interesting to see now that CBS has bought Channel 10. It'll be interesting to see how that works. But Channel 10's used to having foreign owners, so it may not make a huge deal of difference. But at least it's a different voice in the landscape, I guess. I don't know if that answered your question, but I did mean to talk about that before. Thank you.
Tony Abbott said
Hang on, thanks, Jeff. You've had your
keep
go.
politics out of sport, just like the
Just-
whites only Springbok.
Thank you.
Hello, Alan. Just something that you mentioned before the break, that you were saying how newspapers and media are sort of starting to go into left and right, and that's from what I see. I mean, that's something that's missing now. 20 years ago, I used to love being able to read one of the major papers to be able to get a balanced view. Now that's impossible. So every paper is now into a filter bubble. How do you see any way out of that, or because the papers then either become they're either advertising or becoming propaganda for their little respective circle.
Yeah, I don't know what the way out of it is. I think the content isn't always as one way or the other as the perception of the institution, and it's in some people's interests, whether they're politicians or other proprietors, to portray particular organisations as going one way or the other. I do think they are tending to go one way or the other now anyway, but I do think there are people within them that are still trying to present as balanced or portrayal of various issues as they can. And I do think it's up to us as consumers to be alert to that, but there is increasingly a tendency to have an opinion and have a view and to push an agenda, and I think that's part of this everyone has a soapbox thing too, that it's boring to just say here's how it is. You're supposed to say what it all, you're supposed to sort of spruik a position, and there's a lot of pressure to do that, I think. But I do hope we can still maintain a sense of, well, here's what the other side of the argument says and does and is. But in large part it's up to us as consumers to apply critical thinking to what we consume and to work out what we think for ourselves. I don't know whether it's ever going to come back again. I'm not sure what the future holds in terms of the nature of political journalism, but it does feel like it's shifted a lot in the last decade in particular, I think. And we've seen, it isn't helped by the churn of leaders. I think that's just disillusioned people, and you're seeing that play out in the way people are voting now, looking for somebody who's different and looks genuine and authentic and convincing. And I think politicians have been their own worst enemies in trying to be so slick that they've just pissed a huge number of people off, all of them,
John, I'm a retired school teacher, and from the vintage that read the National Times fairly religiously. I just despair, because I was economics and stuff like that, I just despair of the superficiality. I mean, you can wake up in the morning and turn on your phone, and the battle of the bad haircuts is saying, you know, is there going to be a nuclear bomb either floating one way or the other across the Pacific? How do you educate the next generation of people to say, there's some depth here, you've got to work out why people have ended up in these positions, but the newspapers and the very short attention span seems to be saying, well, we'll just go with a bit of jargon and a few sort of main headlines and that's it.
Yeah, and that's depressing for those of us who were brought up in the newspaper world, where we used to read all those papers and try and navigate different opinions and work out what we thought. I mean, you know, Sprig, my own newspaper, what we're about is trying to add some of that value, and I do hope that we get younger readers who having had not very much familiarity with newspapers might find that there is some benefit in reading things for a longer time. I think, you know, one of the advantages we have on the Saturday paper is that it's published on a Saturday when, of all the times in the week, it seems to be the time when people have the most opportunity, if their kids are off playing sport or there's time to take a breath and have a coffee and read, that they can absorb that, and, you know, warms my heart that people are starting to do that. I don't know how you change a whole culture though. I think we're in this shift in the way we consume information and news. Maybe there is a pushback against that. You know, we see people getting fed up with Twitter because it's become such a platform for haters and anonymous kind of people desiring to tear other people down. It's pretty foul, some of the stuff that happens on there. And maybe that people will just drift away from that. But I don't know what's going to be still standing at the end of this big churn, and I hope we're encouraging our young people to look beyond all that rubbish and to try and think more deeply about the world, because they're the ones who are going to have to solve the problems in the future, and so we'd like to think that they're learning some skills, analytical skills and critical thinking skills at the moment. But I can understand the depression and the frustration about it. I feel the same way. I think a lot of people do, and we, like I said, we feel sometimes, I think, in journalism trapped. And I used to talk about being on a hamster wheel. You know, it's one of the great joys of my life not to be in daily journalism anymore, because I did feel like I was sort of, somebody else was always setting the agenda, and it's very, very hard to get out from underneath that, particularly in broadcast where the logistical challenges are great and they just chew up hours of your day just getting through everything, and there's less time for this, you know, because it's all about getting everything organised. It was a huge frustration, and I felt I wasn't doing my best work because it was just going around and around. So, you know, I feel privileged to be in a position now where I can at least have, you know, a couple of days to think about stuff and step back from an issue, or in our case, because my deadline was today for this Saturday, so we have to kind of look over the horizon a little and think, if I'm writing about something that's moving through the week, an issue that's moving, where is it going to land by Saturday? And you have to look at the trajectory of an issue and not make sure you don't fall short and have something published on Saturday that was out of date and looks old from yesterday. So, you know, it is a great privilege to have the opportunity to think more broadly about things, and I hope that people continue to take a breath, you know, and consume news a bit more slowly and thoughtfully. We'll take one question, and then I've got the one from Andrea, who didn't want to use the microphone and wake the baby. So.
Thanks, Karen, for I don't know, so informative tonight and practical.
I hope so.
Stuff that you taught us here. In terms of following on from that last question, in terms of, I guess it's about influence, and but influencing for authenticity. I just want to ask a question in terms of decision making. And we've got, I used to say, in terms of psychological impact, a dozen or so from the 70s, biases, heuristics, natural grammar of decision making, hardwired into our emotions. They've now expanded that out into the field of behavioural economics, and they say there's about 20 of them. And I think, a lot of Trump's success has been in terms of coaching, being coached in terms of that. It's widely used in marketing. I've also heard the New South Wales government here, some people are coached in terms of behavioural economics. Just wondering if you've come across that in terms of that then, you know, influencing people, in some ways sneaky ways, I think,
I think, communication has become so important, mass communication has become so important in politics that a lot of people do all kinds of training to, I can't see it, a lot of people do all kinds of training to maximise their impact, whether it be with their body language or their words. You know, it kind of comes back to that slick marketing I was talking about before, whereas one of the things I often mention when we talk about things like this is in clever use of language department is back when, I think it was the 2004 election when John Howard was up against Mark Latham. I think that was the election that was just after the Children Overboard, and there'd been a lot of debate about the government being untrustworthy and having lied and all of that. And I remember being quite shocked when John Howard announced the election. I was in the room, we were at his press conference, and he said this election will be about trust. Yeah. And there was a sort of sharp intake of breath, and thinking, how audacious. Yeah. That's extraordinary to use that. But what they had done is they had carefully tested that word. They had broken it down in an emotional response sense, and they had worked out how to frame that word so that people's response to it was thinking about it in terms of security, stability, steadiness, not lying, dishonesty. So that I don't think it's kind of getting into the kind of territory you're talking about, where they have researchers who do the work on framing, they call it. So their messaging is framed to push our buttons in a particular way. And I think similarly, certainly politicians get training on how to speak. There are a number of them I know who like to, when they do a TV interview, who like to say, good to be with you. And that's here I am with you, we're all here together. You'll hear a few Labor politicians, one I know very well, who says it a lot. There are techniques that they learn to use. John Howard used to have trouble because he had a shoulder twitch, and his shoulder used to twitch when he got a difficult question and was attempting to avoid answering it straight with his left shoulder, and we used to go, yeah, gotcha. And he had to, and one of his kids actually pointed and said, Dad, you've got to lose the whole shoulder thing, it's really giving you away. And he had to work very hard on that. So I think there's lots of dimensions. There's probably psychological, behavioural things that people are trained in as well. But there's certainly language that they use, and there's appearance, the capping of the teeth, the trimming of the eyebrows, the removing of the frames around the lenses, all of that stuff. It's all part of the marketing of politicians and to make them be able to communicate better. I don't know if that addresses your question, but it's certainly part of the trade these days to learn to communicate en masse with people and have a maximum impact with a maximum number of people. It does make you a bit cynical, but I can.
Why don't we move to discussion?
Oh yes, now Andrea asked me who the most impressive politician I've ever interviewed was, which is a good question. And I'm probably going to have to go the easy route here and say it wasn't a person I interviewed, but it was a person I met and had a conversation with, and that was Nelson Mandela. And we were very privileged many years ago now when Australia awarded him an honorary gong that the Prime Minister presented to him at the Australian High Commissioner's residence in Pretoria in South Africa. And I went, we'd been at the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting in Durban, and then we went to South Africa, and it was a very small gathering of literally just officials and the media and him, and so we got to stand around and drink cups of tea and have a chat, and that was, he was a very impressive person. And it's a great privilege to have this job and to get to be in the presence of interesting people, particularly powerful people, but courageous people. I met Mikhail Gorbachev at one point, who was also a courageous person. Another person that I did interview who was fascinating for a different reason was, I went to Afghanistan. I did 3 embed trips to Afghanistan with the Defence Force. One in 2007, one in 2011, and one in 2012. And on the trip in 2011, that was where we got the kind of greatest access to all kinds of people. And I was able to do a TV interview with a man called Matiullah Khan, who was had just been appointed the local police chief. He was a local warlord in Uruzgan province. He ran a private army of thousands of people. He had been responsible for all manner of atrocities and deaths of people. His army ran the road between Tarankot and Kandahar, and basically defence forces from the coalition countries had to pay them protection money to make sure that their convoys weren't attacked. And I got to sit down and interview him. He was illiterate, but this incredibly powerful man, and he was frightened of the TV interview and didn't want to do it, and got bullied into it by the American colonel that was working with him. But it was a very interesting conversation with a person who, you know, had this incredible reputation, but sitting there one-on-one didn't seem nearly as terrifying and powerful as he clearly actually was. So some of those opportunities have been extraordinary, and you know, that's the great privilege of being in a job where you get to represent other people, where you try to ask the hard questions and try to do things to the best of your ability, and you get to sit in places and meet people that you otherwise wouldn't. I got to when George Bush was president, we were at the White House, and it was just before the Iraq War. And when we went to the White House, again, we used to have to band together as a group of journalists, and they would sometimes concede to let us all into the Oval Office, but really there were too many of us and they didn't like that, and they would restrict the questions to 2 from the Australian media, or visiting media, and 2 from the American media. So we would all crowd in. You would have seen those TV shots of the President and whichever Prime Minister sitting on the chairs in the Oval Office, and we're all taking pictures of the desk over our shoulders, and you know, being starstruck and trying to focus on the job. And we used to draw straws of who would ask the question. So we would have to get our heads together as the Australian press and say, okay, what are the 2 questions that are the most important for all of us? And we would argue about that, work out what the question was, and then we would draw straws on who got to ask it, because of course everybody wanted to be the one that asked the question. And I got to ask one of them when George Bush was president, and it was about what his message would be about going to war in Iraq to the Australian people. And at the time, my father was travelling in Asia, and he was in his hotel room in Hanoi, I think, flicked on the television, and CNN was on, and they obviously had nothing better to cover, so they'd cut to the Oval Office at the White House, and he said, "Oh, there's the Australian Prime Minister," and he was listening, and then he said, "That's my daughter." So you know, we got to have a bit of excitement occasionally as well. But yeah, it's an interesting job, and Mandela would definitely be the most interesting person, I think.
Yeah, hello Karen. My name's John, and I go back to Mungo McCullum in the Sunday Review.
I remember Mungo too.
Which is probably before even you.
He does our crosswords, you know.
I know, but they're too easy.
I'll let him know.
Let him know, yeah.
Give me a Friday David Astell, that's fine. Yeah.
Must be the life on the North Coast. It's just too comfortable for him.
Yeah. Anyhow, what can be done about the tendency of media now to report on what's happening in social media? They don't do their investigations, they just report this is what is trending on, this is obviously news. It never gets debunked, or maybe 6 months later after a complaint to the Press Council, and absolutely nothing happens, and this gets disseminated, and a lot of it is absolute crap.
I agree with you there. That's a trap. Sometimes you can get an indication of when a subject or an idea is taken hold by what's happening on social media, but it can also be a trap because it can only be representative of a very small slice of the people who are on the internet, on that form of social media at that moment, who have that view. So I think it's quite dangerous, and I do think we have to be careful about that. It has really taken off. I haven't noticed it quite as much recently as it did when in the very early days of things like Twitter. I feel like there's not as much saying, you know, trending on Twitter was blah blah blah, because I just think for the people who aren't on Twitter, who cares? And I'm never quite sure what the point of it is, because you often can't tell. It goes back to that point about the veracity of things. When you can't, it's an incredibly useful tool as a journalist for picking up information, but you've got to remember that you do have to check things. And so I'm always a bit puzzled about people just taking it as gospel, and you do have to be really careful about that, because people can say anything. They do say anything. and they forget that they haven't checked it, and that they've just heard someone say it, and then they broadcast it.
It's your millennials doing it generally.
Well,
cut it out.
Not only, it's old, like I said, there's the dinosaurs like me too. It's a powerful tool, but it's a dangerous tool too. You know, information can spread literally in the blink of an eye, and alternative facts can spread as well. I've seen marketing campaigns go wrong on social media in a flash and absolutely disastrous. I don't know, do you remember one called Qantas Luxury, where Qantas was offering it was something like a free pair of pyjamas or something or other, and they got humiliated. That was an example where that did get reported because they had to pull their campaign. It was such a disaster. So there are times, I think, when it is indicative, but you do have to be careful that you're not extrapolating and drawing conclusions from things on social media that are not actually accurate and then become self-fulfilling.
Yeah.
And that's always a danger, especially in politics, I think. Yeah.
Okay.
I'd just like to know, will merging metropolitan and regional newspaper and television will provide better news services for us? So now I can know stuff about what's going on in Dubbo or Orange or even in Queensland, or will it just provide more TV ratings because they only counted the 5 metropolitan area, and the bachelors is 1 million, so that means we're going to 2 million because now they're counted in
Sorry,
double.
I missed that last bit, sorry.
Because only about 901,000 people watched The Bachelorette yesterday,
Yeah.
but then we count Sydney, Melbourne, Adelaide, Perth, and all the 5 metropolitan areas, but they never count Dubbo, or they never count Darwin, like Tasmania.
Well, this is the eternal question, isn't it? That if it's hard to see how a greater concentration of ownership can make a more diverse product in the end. The one hope, though, I think, is what has happened through the advent of technologies. You are seeing more small publications spring up, like mine, but others as well. And I hope that means that there will be still local news outlets in small towns, and you won't only have to get capital city news. But in terms of TV and radio, that is increasingly the case, and we've seen that change over the years. The aggregation and then the disaggregation, and now I think recently I was listening to Malcolm Turnbull was doing an interview on FM radio in Townsville, which now, because I have a smartphone, I can listen to hit 103 FM Townsville by pushing a button and hearing him talk live. And they were advertising the fact that Channel 9 has just started a Far North Queensland news service and employed a whole lot of journalists. So that's interesting. Maybe there is a view that less of all of this and more of focusing on the local community, and you can I guess you can do that the more that we have the ability to work out demographics and who consumes what media in what place, because we all leave a technological footprint. Maybe there is an upside to that, and maybe they will start to create more local news. I hope so, because I don't think we need international news, or we certainly need a national view and all of that, but I do think we also need to know what's happening in our local community. And sometimes I've been guilty of that. Like, I started on the Canberra Times in Canberra, but I forget to read it a lot now because I live in national politics world, and I tend to read the national politics, and it can make you miss the stuff that's happening right in front of you in your own town. And so I do think it's important that we do pay attention and that we do have a diversity of news produced in the communities that we live in. Otherwise we become completely connected to the world and disconnected to the next door neighbour. And that's the downside, I think, of the way we use our technology. So I don't know is the answer.
Any other questions? No. Now repeat. I've got one for you too.
Since you're giving me the opportunity.
Please go ahead.
I bemoan journalism that's all about opinion. You're missing. It seems to be more and more that when you go online, all you're getting is opinion articles. And what I'm looking for is sort of reporting of the facts, so I can figure it out for myself. But at the same time, sometimes the factual reporting unless you're embedded in that world, it's really hard to understand what's really happening behind the scenes and which is the good guy and which is the bad guy, and you need somebody to interpret it for you. So I'm a little bit torn. So perhaps you could comment on opinion journalism versus factual journalism.
Yeah, so that you're right, that opinion has been creeping in probably more than 10 years. There's a lot more opinion now, and there's a mixture. And I think it's come because of that very dilemma that you have described, that people, they do want the facts, but sometimes the facts don't always speak fully for themselves, and you want to understand the context of it. And that's, I suppose, the job of people who've been in political journalism for a long time. That should be our job. It should be what we're qualified to provide, which is a bit of historical context. Well, see what's happening here. This has actually happened before, and the way it played out last time was X, or this person is saying this for appears to be saying this for these reasons. Now, there's a fine line between that kind of analysis and context and opinion, and sometimes we do cross it, I agree. So I do think there's a place for the value add context around information, and sometimes the facts are not actually enough to fully inform you. You need to understand the context of the facts. There might be a timeliness context, there might be some kind of historical thing, there might be some other agenda at play that is important to understand, that makes this more important than it looks or less important than it looks. So I do think we have to do that, but sometimes we do tend to stray into offering a view, and we're put in positions as journalists where we're asked for a view frequently. I do the Insiders program on the ABC, get to sit on the couch or in the end chair and argue with Jared Henderson or various other people, and I feel I kind of check myself and think, okay, well, what's my role here? Maybe often I feel like it's more to try and analyse than to offer a view. Sometimes I offer a view, but I'm quite cautious about what I offer a view on, because I don't want to be seen to be taking a particular side or to be able to be pigeonholed one way or the other. But it is easy to slide into that and not sort of realise it, and then people can legitimately turn around and say, well, you're always on Team X or Team Y, you never argue the alternative position. There are plenty of people who say that that's perfectly legitimate, and if that's what people know that you are, then that's fine. But I do think there's a place for trying not to just slide into that without realising it. So I understand the dilemma. The dilemma is on the end of the purveyors of the news as well as the consumers of it, the same.
Is there any other questions? I've got one. Since I'm a reader of the Saturday paper, the most startling thing I read this year, I think this year, was Gillian Triggs' interview. Maybe it was really early in the year, about what it's like to deal with the minister and the parliament, the government people actually. It was one of the sharpest, most trenchant arguments against them, and it was really just unrestrained. And I was thinking, wow, what did the people at the Saturday paper think about that text before they printed it? And in any case, leaving aside that it caused her a lot of problems, isn't this a reflection of the sort of savagery of the institutional conflicts going on in Australia now? That the media cannot avoid being torn up along with the other powerful forces who are fighting each other so hardly and so harshly.
Go Gadfly.
Yeah, Richard, yes. Yeah, that interview was, that's the Ramona Cabal, there was an interview that we ran a transcript of the interview with Gillian, and I think unfortunately for Gillian, she said more than she
really meant to.
And then doubly unfortunately, she then told a fib, not inadvertently, but wasn't quite accurate when she gave evidence to the Senate committee about what she'd said, and she basically said we'd made something up effectively. Now, as a newspaper, you can't allow that allegation to stand because it's a reputational question. So we had to prove that in fact what she had said was what she had said, and she had to account for herself. So that was a problem, I think, kind of for her making. But you can't help sometimes as media organisations but get caught up in these battles, and you know, it's the business we're in really. For better or worse, these things become newsworthy, and so you try, you know, you give voice to one side or the other side. You know, I'm not so purist as to say that, oh, if we've only got an interview with Gillian Triggs, we can't run it because we don't have an interview with George Brandis or whatever. You know, I think it's legitimate to put one person's view forward. But you will face criticism from some people that you're running the agenda of one particular person. Yeah, that was a particularly controversial interview that she gave, and it was a bit difficult to cover that whole issue because she made some mistakes, but she also made some reasonable points in general, and the government was certainly out to get her. And it's quite complex to try and report on something like that. It was interesting, slightly separate, but in a similar vein. I did a piece about the Attorney General's battle with the Solicitor General, and there was the Solicitor General appeared before a Senate inquiry and kind of got a pasting but gave one as well. And I was really conscious about all the dimensions in that, the legal questions, the ethical questions, the importance of being fair to individuals whose jobs were on the line, but also putting some context around these things, saying this is what he said, but this is the implication of what he said. And I remember really sweating over this piece and putting it together, and I thought it was as fair as I could make it, and I got a lot of feedback to that effect, that people thought it was fair. And I was driving back from the south coast to Canberra. I was driving through Cooma and my phone rang, and it was the Attorney General ringing to congratulate me on a very fair piece. I wasn't sure what to make of that. I nearly ran off the road, but you know, to his credit, it wasn't all flattering of him, and I thought that was a very decent of him. And in fact, interestingly, the Solicitor General, it appeared on Saturday and the Solicitor General resigned on Monday, so I didn't know if there was any link between the two things, but I did try and be as fair as I could. And you do wrestle with these issues sometimes about the risk of being played, being used by particular people who see it as advantageous to either leak something to a particular organisation or push a line out that they know that someone will publish to achieve some other effect. And that's from my point of view anyway, for journalists, that's a constant question about how much is this story worth, and am I sure that I'm not just being used. And I certainly can think of examples when I was a young journalist where I didn't realise it at the time, and then afterwards I realised that I had been completely snowed and played, and there was nothing I could do about it. But you have to be vigilant about that, particularly in political journalism.
Is Ralph? Come on.
Just one quick comment. There was a beautiful cartoon I saw today on the ABC. Well, you had the ABC logo, you had the presenter saying, okay, here we have a renowned expert on this matter, very well educated, all the rest. In the interest of balance, on this side we have someone who's got no idea what they're talking about. And unfortunately that is becoming the ABC.
What would Tony Jones say? I think I'll take that as a comment. Given that I don't work for them, I won't feel any compunction to either pull them down or lead to their defence. I do casual work for them. Yeah.
Do I have to?
Yes, go.
Yes, that's right.
Please go ahead.
Do you have any perception that the current cabinet is gaining the courage to put down the negativity of Abbott and Howard? Is it changing ever so slightly for the better?
I feel like the Prime Minister has a bit more confidence lately than he has had in the past. I think it was a shock when he nearly lost the election. and I think a lot of people had high expectations and he didn't meet them, whatever they were, for a lot of people, and so he's battled that sense of disappointment, which is really difficult to get out from under. And one of the things I often think about in life generally is that a good reputation is not very difficult to maintain, but a bad one is extremely hard to recover from, and that's truer in politics than anywhere else. And I think, you know, he has struggled, and it hasn't helped him that he's had these opponents inside his own party and these sort of increasingly diverse ideologies that he's trying to manage. And he hasn't appeared for a long time to have the confidence, and I think one of the criticisms that is made of him and his decision making is that he has, it's been hard to tell what he actually believes in, because he hasn't made firm decisions about things, or he's made a decision and then he's changed his mind. But the same criticism has been made about Bill Shorten, mind you, and I think neither of them score very highly in the opinion polls, and maybe that's what's being reflected. So I do feel like there's a bit of patience is kind of wearing a bit thin in the cabinet about some of the bomb throwing that's been going on from the sidelines from the former Prime Minister and the people that support him. And increasingly I think you're starting to see that even people who would have similar conservative views, to socially and economically conservative views to Tony Abbott, people like Peter Dutton and Matthias Cormann, increasingly you're seeing them speaking out saying that's enough. So I think that's a sign that that maybe we've reached a tipping point where a few of them have decided that this is now undermining the fate of the Liberal National Coalition, and it has to stop. I don't think it hasn't stopped. I'm not sure that it's going to in the short term. I don't know what, maybe the result of the postal survey might have an impact on that one way or the other, whatever that result is, I don't know. But they're certainly using that as another platform, and the energy debate is another platform, and that comes back to this context thing. These are all about these issues, but they're also about something else. And I do feel like the Prime Minister he appears to have more confidence in the way he's managing things. It interests me that he's doing all these FM radio things now too. I think he must have research that says he needs to be the more kind of human face and needs to connect with young people more, because he's everywhere on FM radio and on commercial TV, on those morning programs, you know, holding up signs and answering questions about Game of Thrones and all of that stuff, which might make some people roll their eyes, but it engages with a particular demographic that he obviously hasn't done very well with. So it does seem to me like he's got a bit more confidence, but I think we need to see how a few big issues play out before the end of the year, and I don't know what his fate will be.
Just a very quick one, Peter. How do you respond to your critics when you're on the insider, you and the other so-called lefty journalists, Andrew Bolt, Miranda Devine? Have you got an answer to them saying that the Insiders is run by a compere is nothing but left-wing and ABC?
Well, Barry can answer for himself. I've known Barry since he was Bob Hawke's press secretary, and I used to quake when I had to ring him up and ask him questions because he was ferocious. And the nice thing for me was, despite those terrifying engagements with him right back in the 80s, when he got the support of the ABC to do Insiders, he came to Canberra and he asked a handful of us to come to lunch, and he pitched this show and said, would you be involved? And I was one of them. So, you know, we managed to maintain a degree of civility through that engagement, and I've got a lot of respect for Barry and the way he manages things, but sure, they cop a lot from Andrew Bolt and Miranda Devine. Miranda, you know, I think she only went on that program once. They asked her many, many times, and she wouldn't go on it. Same with Janet Albrechtsen, and then Janet was on the board subsequently, so she couldn't really. Andrew was on it for a long time. I was on it with Andrew. And now they've created, that show actually has created Andrew Bolt. Now he's got his own show, and he's a big media personality in his own right. Look, they're entitled to their views. I'm not going to try and defend the entire ABC or Barry, as I said, Barry can speak for himself. I will defend my own conduct and answer specific criticisms that whenever they make them. They do sometimes make them. And you know, I've always been of the view that it's great to have those discussions. I don't think everyone should be in furious agreement all the time. I don't think the only way we work out how we feel about an issue is to hear various people's views about it. So I don't think we should be shutting down debate. I don't think people should be allowed to say things that are inciting hatred and all that sort of stuff, but up to that point, you know, let's have the discussion. Let's hear your argument. I'll put my argument and people will make up their minds. And that's what comes back to the thing I said at the beginning about persuasion. That's what politics used to be about. That's old school, and I think that's what it should still be about in politics, but also if you're having a political discussion in journalism as well. We should be able to be civil. We should be able to listen to each other's views and actually debate and discuss them. What worries me is on programs like Andrew's, he mostly gets on the people that agree with him, and they all shout furiously about people who aren't there. Sometimes they have people on that he has a robust argument with, and I think that's great. But often it's the echo chamber phenomenon. It's a bit like the social media question. We're all shouting and listening to each other shout, and it seems like everyone's shouting, and it's only a few loud voices.
And that becomes the news.
And that becomes the news. Yeah, that's right. So yeah, I'm happy to have a debate with Andrew anytime. I remember a program I was on Insiders once with Piers Ackerman and David Marr. And I don't know why I used to get the short straw to go on with them, because it was like a tennis game. You would often be in between them, and then you would be this and that, and they just used to bait each other. They were as bad as each other. And I had been at a family event the day before that with some elderly aunts who, I think my mother might have been there, and she'd said, oh, well, Karen's going to be on the television, on Sunday. And so I remember thinking that the elderly aunts were all tuning in this particular Sunday morning. The discussion was about some civil, it was the gay marriage debate, but it was after the ACT had introduced civil unions. And somehow the civil unions debate got right out of control, and Piers was talking about sex with animals and I was blanching, and just all I could think about was that my elderly aunts were all behind me watching this, and they were really going at each other because David's gay and outspoken defender of human rights generally on the left of politics, and so the two of them were just shredding each other. Then off camera, afterwards, the three of us were catching a taxi to the airport together, and Piers was in the front seat and I was in the back with David, and we were sort of going along, and then Piers just sort of over his shoulder just says, oh, I don't really have a problem with civil unions. And David leapt out of his seat and leapt, and I thought he was going to strangle it. I had to physically dive in between the two. So some of it is for show, some of it is theatrics, not all of it is always genuine.
I saw that show, but I wasn't sitting with your arms.
Okay. Thanks very much. Okay, if there's no more questions, I think we'll wrap it up. So anyone really desperate? Otherwise, please thank Karen Middleton very much.